In the summer of 1928, one of the most famous explorers alive vanished over the Arctic Ocean, and a wealthy American woman who had never led an expedition in her life spent 3 months and 10,000 miles searching for him. She never found him. Nobody ever did, and that failure, strange as it sounds, is the exact reason her name belongs in the story at all. Her name was Louise Boyd. Between 1926 and 1955, she poured almost her entire personal fortune into the Arctic, funding 7 expeditions, mapping fjords no ship had ever entered, and eventually becoming the first woman to fly over the North Pole. Let's start with the search that never ended, and then go back to the beginning to see how a California socialite ended up looking for a dead man in the ice in the first place. Chapter 1: The Girl Who Watched Him Sail. And Louise Arner Boyd was born on September the 16th, 1887, in San Rafael, California, into serious money. Her father, John Franklin Boyd, was part owner of a gold mine in the town of Bodie, one of the more successful strikes to come out of California's gold rush era, and the family fortune it produced was substantial even by the standards of the Gilded Age. Bodie itself, by the time Louise was born, had already passed its wildest boomtown years, but the wealth it generated for the families who'd gotten in early enough continued to compound for decades afterward, funding exactly the kind of comfortable, secure upbringing that most Americans of the period could barely imagine. Her mother, Louise Cook Arner, came from an established New York family. Louise grew up with 2 older brothers, Seth and John, competing and playing alongside them through the hills of Marin County and Oakland in what was, by every account, a genuinely happy, privileged childhood filled with tutors, travel, and the unhurried comfort that old money affords. That childhood ended abruptly. In 1901 and 1902, both of her brothers died of rheumatic heart disease, a common and often fatal complication of childhood illness in this era, within a year of each other. Louise, still a teenager herself, became her parents' only surviving child. I want to pause on what that actually did to her family, because it explains something that otherwise looks strange for the period. With no son left to inherit or to train up in the family's business affairs, her father began doing something almost unheard of for a wealthy Victorian-era daughter. He started teaching Louise how to manage money, how to think about investment, how to actually run the financial machinery of a serious fortune. It wasn't affection alone driving that decision. It was necessity, but the effect was the same either way. Louise Boyd grew up understanding capital in a hands-on, practical way that almost no woman of her class and generation was ever given the chance to learn. It's worth pausing on how directly that early, unusual education would end up shaping everything that came afterward. A woman who understood exactly how her own money worked, who had been taught from adolescence to think of a fortune as something to be actively managed rather than simply enjoyed, was always going to make different choices with that fortune than someone who had never been trusted with the details at all. I will mention, because it foreshadows something that becomes the entire engine of the story, a moment from when Louise was 19 years old. In 1906, the Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen sailed into San Francisco Bay, having just become the first person in history to successfully navigate the entire Northwest Passage by sea, a feat European explorers had died trying to accomplish for nearly 4 centuries. Louise, by her own later account, may have been among the crowds who watched him arrive. Whether she stood on the docks that specific day or simply followed the news coverage from home, Amundsen became, from that point forward, something close to a personal idol for her, the living embodiment of exactly the kind of daring, purposeful adventure a wealthy young woman in Edwardian California had no realistic path toward ever attempting herself. Keep that image in your head. A teenage girl watching a famous polar explorer step off his ship with absolutely no way of knowing that the same man's disappearance 22 years later would become the event that finally launched her into a life very much like his own. Now, before we go any further, I want to pause on something because I think this channel exists for exactly this kind of story. If you're the kind of person who likes watching history's forgotten corners get pulled back into the light, sticking around and subscribing genuinely helps more of these get made, and if you want to dig into the primary sources yourself, they're linked below. Anyway, let's get back to Louise Boyd because it's about to take one more devastating loss to finally set her free. I think it's worth pausing here on who exactly Roald Amundsen was, because his fame in 1928 is genuinely hard to overstate from a modern vantage point, and I don't think this story lands properly without understanding it. By the time Louise Boyd was watching him disembark in San Francisco, Amundsen had already spent years quietly building a reputation as the most technically skilled polar operator of his generation, a man who studied Inuit survival techniques, dog sledding methods, and cold weather clothing with an obsessive attention to detail that put most of his European contemporaries to shame. He would go on, 5 years later, to lead the first expedition to reach the geographic South Pole, beating the ill-fated British expedition under Robert Falcon Scott by more than a month, a victory that made him, almost overnight, one of the most famous human beings on the planet, and one that came with a tragic postscript. Scott and his entire party died on their own return journey, transforming Amundsen's clean, well-planned triumph into one half of one of the most famous rivalries in the history of exploration. He attempted, and very nearly achieved, a flight over the North Pole by airship in 1926, narrowly losing that specific record to an American rival by a matter of days, and completing the crossing instead alongside the very man, Umberto Nobile, whose disappearance 2 years later would end up costing Amundsen his own life. By 1928, he was, by any reasonable measure, the closest thing the world had to a celebrity scientist adventurer, a man whose face was recognizable on multiple continents and whose name was genuinely synonymous with the entire idea of polar exploration. This is the man Louise Boyd had idolized since she was a teenager. This is the man whose disappearance would come to define the rest of her life. Louise Boyd's own path back toward the Arctic did not begin with any of this drama. In 1919, her mother died. The following year, 1920, her father died as well. Louise was 32 years old, unmarried, with no siblings left alive and no immediate family whatsoever, and she inherited a fortune reported at roughly $3 million, an almost incomprehensible sum for the era, hers now to spend entirely as she pleased. It's worth pausing on the shape of that inheritance for a moment, because it's genuinely similar to a pattern we've seen elsewhere in this kind of story: grief and total, sudden freedom arriving as the exact same event. Louise Boyd had spent her entire adult life as a dutiful daughter in a prominent, tightly bound California family. She woke up within the span of a single year, the last person standing in that family, and one of the wealthiest unmarried women on the west coast of the United States. In 1924, she took a trip to Norway and saw the polar ice pack for the first time in her life. She would later describe the experience as instrumental, one of the defining moments of her entire existence, though at the time it produced nothing more concrete than a growing, restless fascination. In 1926, that fascination turned into action. Louise Boyd chartered her own ship and crew, becoming, by most accounts, the first woman in history to personally finance and lead an expedition into the polar seas. Her destination was Franz Josef Land, a scattering of remote islands north of Siberia, some of the most isolated territory on the planet. Her ship, fittingly, was a small Norwegian vessel called the Hobby. the very same ship that had once carried Amundsen himself, along with the American explorer Lincoln Ellsworth, on an earlier Arctic expedition. I want to be honest about what this first expedition actually was, because I don't think it does Louise Boyd any favors to pretend it was already the serious scientific enterprise her later career would become. This was, by every account, a pleasure trip dressed up as an adventure. Boyd and a group of wealthy friends set out with the explicit goal of big game hunting, and by the time the trip concluded, Louise Boyd had personally shot 11 polar bears. Newspapers around the world ate it up, dubbing her the Arctic Diana and the girl who tamed the Arctic, and a French count even published a book of her photographs from the trip, titled, in its original French, roughly Hunts and Adventures in the Polar Regions. She returned home with thousands of feet of film and hundreds of photographs, evidence, even at this early stage, of an instinct for documentation that would eventually become far more valuable than any trophy she brought back. I think it's worth sitting with this honestly rather than skipping past it. By modern standards, hunting 11 polar bears for sport is genuinely difficult to celebrate, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but it's also true that in 1926, trophy hunting of exactly this kind was considered a perfectly respectable, even admirable pursuit for wealthy adventurers of both genders. The same impulse that filled natural history museums across the world with specimens collected by people who would never have called themselves poachers. Louise Boyd, at this exact moment in her story, was not yet an explorer in any serious sense. She was a rich, restless socialite who had found an unusually cold and dangerous playground, and if her story had ended right here, she would likely be remembered today, if at all, as one more wealthy adventuress of the Gilded Age, indistinguishable from dozens of others. It did not end there. Chapter 2, 22 Lives. By the summer of 1928, Louise Boyd was ready to do it all again. She had chartered the hobby a second time, assembled another group of friends, and arrived in the far northern Norwegian port city of Tromsø, fully intending to repeat the same kind of pleasure trip and hunting expedition that had made her briefly famous 2 years earlier. Tromsø itself, in the summer of 1928, was already a strange, charged place to be. It sat at the natural staging point for anyone heading further north into the Arctic, and that particular summer it had filled with far more military officers, aviators, and journalists than a small Norwegian port town would normally ever see at once, all of them drawn there by the unfolding noble disaster, weeks before Boyd's own arrival even registered as part of the same story. She had every reason to expect this second trip would look almost exactly like the first. You might think that's exactly what happened. It is not. While Boyd was in Tromsø preparing to sail, news broke that would upend not just her own plans, but a significant portion of the world's attention that summer. Roald Amundsen, the man Louise Boyd had idolized since she was 19 years old, had vanished. Let me explain what had actually happened, because the full context matters enormously here. Weeks earlier, an Italian airship called the Italia, commanded by an aviator named Umberto Nobile, had crashed on the Arctic pack ice while returning from a flight over the North Pole. The impact scattered survivors and wreckage across the ice, and some of Nobile's crew, injured and stranded with almost no supplies, managed to send out a faint radio distress signal that took days to even be picked up by anyone capable of acting on it. As news of the disaster spread, an enormous international rescue effort assembled almost overnight. Ships and aircraft from 6 different European countries converging on the region to search for survivors, one of the largest peacetime rescue operations the world had yet seen, covered breathlessly by newspapers on multiple continents. Amundsen, despite a long and famously bitter rivalry with Nobile dating back to their earlier jointly led airship expedition across the North Pole in 1926, a partnership that had ended in mutual public recrimination over who deserved credit for the flight, did not hesitate for a moment. He volunteered to fly a French seaplane north to join the search himself, setting aside years of personal animosity the instant actual lives were on the line. On June 18, 1928, Amundsen took off from Norway with a French crew of 5 other men. He was never seen again. His plane simply disappeared over the Barents Sea, swallowed by exactly the kind of Arctic conditions he had spent his entire career learning to survive. I think it's worth sitting with the strange, almost unbearable irony of that fact for a moment. The single most accomplished, most technically skilled polar explorer alive in 1928 died, or very likely died, attempting to rescue a rival he had every personal reason to resent in a plane that was never designed for the kind of flight he was attempting, over water that had already claimed countless less famous men before him. News of his disappearance spread through Tromsø within hours, transforming the town's already tense, crowded atmosphere into something closer to open shock. This was not simply another name added to a list of missing airmen. This was Amundsen, a man whose survival skill had always seemed, to the public imagination, almost supernatural, the one explorer everyone had assumed was simply too good at this to die doing it. Keep this loss in mind as we go forward, because we're going to come back to exactly what was, and was not, ever found of him, and it's stranger and sadder than you might expect. Louise Boyd, sitting in Tromsø with a chartered ship, a hunting party of friends, and a summer's worth of pleasure trip plans already arranged, made her decision almost instantly. She offered the Norwegian government the full use of the hobby, along with its crew, its provisions, and its fuel, to join the official search effort, and then she added a condition of her own. She wanted to go along personally. This was not a small ask. The men actually organizing the search, senior military officers, veteran polar aviators, some of the most experienced Arctic operators alive, had assembled a genuinely dangerous high-stakes operation, and by Boyd's own later account, no allowances whatsoever had been made in anyone's planning for the presence of a woman. It's worth imagining what that specific conversation must have actually looked like. A wealthy American tourist, known locally, if she was known at all, for a pleasure cruise and a pile of bear pelts 2 summers earlier, walking into a room full of exhausted military commanders, coordinating a live international rescue operation and asking to be led on to one of their search vessels. She asked anyway. Later, explaining her decision in words that would end up quoted for the rest of her life, she said simply, "How could I go on a pleasure trip when those 22 lives were at stake?" The Norwegian government said yes. I think it's worth pausing here on exactly what kind of transformation this moment actually represents, because it happens almost instantly in the space of a single decision made in a Norwegian port town. One day, Louise Boyd is a wealthy tourist planning to shoot more polar bears for sport. The next, she is an accepted, if unusual, participant in one of the largest international search and rescue operations the Arctic had ever seen, standing shoulder to shoulder with the same category of hardened military and exploration professionals who had, only days earlier, seen no place in their plans for someone like her at all. It's worth noting, too, that this wasn't purely a charitable gesture on Boyd's part, even if it read that way in the newspapers. She had a genuinely capable, well-provisioned ship already sitting in port, fully crewed and ready to sail, at the exact moment an international rescue effort desperately needed exactly that kind of resource. Her money didn't just buy her a seat at the table, it gave her something the search organizers genuinely needed, And that combination, real capability paired with a wealthy volunteer's willingness to hand it over, is very likely the actual reason the door opened for her at all, whatever her own personal motives happen to be underneath it. If you've made it this far into the story, this is exactly the kind of sudden, high-stakes turn this channel loves digging into, and if that's the sort of thing you enjoy, there's a subscribe button that genuinely helps keep more of these coming. Now let's follow Louise Boyd out onto the Barents Sea, because the search for Roald Amundsen is about to become the single defining experience of her entire life, whether or not it ever actually finds him. Chapter 3, 10,000 Miles of Nothing. The search that followed lasted roughly 10 weeks and covered something in the neighborhood of 10,000 miles of open Arctic water, from the pack ice north of Franz Josef Land all the way west to the coast of Greenland. Let me try to describe what that actually meant in practice, because I think the sheer scale of it is easy to let slide past as just a big number. 10,000 miles of searching meant weeks of scanning empty, ice-choked ocean from the deck of a small chartered ship, watching a horizon that rarely offered anything except more water, more ice, and more fog, in temperatures and conditions that had already killed the very man they were looking for. Visibility could collapse without warning, fog rolling in thick enough to reduce the search to almost nothing more than blind listening, engines idling while lookouts strained for any sound that didn't belong. It meant long stretches with no real news, no confirmation that the search was making any progress at all, sustained entirely by the grim, unspoken possibility that today might be the day they found something, and the far more likely possibility that they wouldn't. Boyd, aboard the Hobby, worked alongside professional aviators, military officers, and polar veterans from multiple countries, an entirely different social environment from the friends and hunting guides she'd sailed with only weeks earlier. She took on real responsibilities within the search effort, and by every account handled them with a level of seriousness and competence that surprised at least some of the men who had been skeptical of her presence from the start. It's worth pausing on how quickly this reversal happened. The same woman who had arrived in Tromsø planning to shoot more polar bears was now spending 16-hour days scanning open water for wreckage, coordinating with search vessels from other nations, and holding up, physically and mentally, under conditions that had already broken more experienced people. She learned in these few short weeks to read pack ice with real discernment, to anticipate weather shifts that could trap a ship for days, to manage a crew's morale through a search that offered almost nothing in the way of encouraging news, skills that had absolutely nothing to do with anything she'd learned running a wealthy household or hosting a dinner party back in California, and everything to do with the specific, unglamorous work of actually operating a ship in the Arctic under pressure. In late August of 1928, a Norwegian fishing vessel recovered a fuel tank and a pontoon float, unmistakably wreckage from Amundsen's missing French seaplane floating in open water. For a moment, this felt like the breakthrough the entire search had been waiting for. If wreckage had surfaced here, surely the rest of the plane, and perhaps even survivors, couldn't be far away. Search vessels converged on the area, crews doubling their efforts, working the surrounding water with a fresh, sharpened sense of purpose after weeks of increasingly grim routine. Boyd and the others aboard the Hobby held on to the same cautious hope everyone else in the search fleet was holding on to. Nothing else was ever found. No further wreckage, no bodies, no trace of Amundsen or the 5 French crewmen who had gone down with him. The pontoon and the fuel tank remain to this day the only physical evidence ever recovered of what happened to that plane, and by extension, of what happened to one of the most famous explorers who ever lived. I think it's worth sitting with that unresolved ending for a moment, because it's the real emotional center of this entire story, the reason we opened this video with it in the first place. We will likely never know exactly how Amundsen died, whether the plane crashed on impact, whether it broke apart slowly in rough seas, whether he survived the initial crash only to die of exposure on a scrap of floating wreckage before any rescuer could possibly have reached him. Search theories at the time ranged across all of these possibilities and more, debated in newspapers for months, none of them ever confirmed by so much as a single additional piece of debris. The Barents Sea simply closed back over the question and never gave it up. Keep that unresolved mystery in mind as we move forward through the rest of Louise Boyd's career, because in a very real sense, she spent the following 4 decades of her life still standing at the edge of it. Partway through the broader search effort, a Soviet icebreaker called the Crossing succeeded in locating and rescuing the surviving members of Nobile's original crew, stranded for weeks on the drifting pack ice, their supplies nearly exhausted, several of them badly injured from the initial crash. It was, by any measure, a genuine triumph, and international news coverage treated it as such, a dramatic, successful rescue snatched from what had looked like a near-certain tragedy, splashed across front pages that had spent weeks running increasingly grim updates. You might think that news would have brought a matching sense of hope to the parallel search for Amundsen. It did not. Noble's men had been found because searchers knew, with reasonable confidence, roughly where their crashed airship had gone down, a fixed point on the ice that search planes could return to again and again as conditions allowed. Amundsen's plane had vanished somewhere over open water, with no crash site, no debris field, no fixed point to search around at all, an entirely different and considerably harder kind of problem. The rescue of one group of missing men changed nothing about the odds facing the other. If anything, it made the contrast starker. Some of the missing had been found alive. Amundsen, quite clearly by this point, was not going to be. The formal search for Amundsen was eventually called off as summer turned toward autumn, and the Arctic ice began closing in for the winter, exactly the kind of seasonal deadline that had shaped Arctic expeditions for centuries. Louise Boyd returned home having failed entirely and completely at the one specific goal she had actually set out to accomplish. She did not find Roald Amundsen. Nobody ever would. And yet, by the time she stepped off that ship, Louise Boyd had become something she had never been before. A serious, internationally recognized figure in the world of Arctic exploration. The Norwegian government awarded her the Chevalier Cross of the Order of St. Olav, making her the first American woman and only the 3rd woman in the entire world to receive it. The French government made her a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor. Newspapers that had once covered her as a wealthy socialite shooting polar bears for sport now covered her as a serious contributor to one of the great international rescue operations of the decade, running her photograph alongside language usually reserved for decorated military officers rather than society heiresses. I think this is genuinely the pivotal moment of Louise Boyd's entire life, and I want to be precise about exactly what it reveals. She had spent an enormous amount of money and personal risk chasing a goal she completely failed to achieve, and that failure, that specific, total, unresolved failure to find a dead man, is what actually launched her real career. Sometimes the most important thing that ever happens to a person isn't a success at all. It's a serious, costly failure, pursued with enough integrity that everyone watching understands exactly what it cost you to try. If you've made it about halfway through this story, thank you, genuinely. And if you haven't already, hitting subscribe is a real help in getting more of these made. Now, let's follow Louise Boyd into the decade that actually made her a scientist, because everything that happens next depends entirely on what she chose to do with the reputation this failed search had just handed her. Throughout the 1930s, Louise Boyd built a genuine, lasting partnership with the American Geographical Society, one of the oldest and most respected geographical institutions in the world, and used it to transform herself from a well-connected amateur into one of the era's most productive Arctic researchers. Between 1931 and 1938, she organized and personally financed a series of expeditions to the east coast of Greenland, bringing along professional botanists, geologists, and topographers rather than hunting guides, and directing genuinely rigorous scientific field work rather than sport. Her ship on these voyages, the Veslikari, carried specialized equipment for exactly this kind of work: an early echo-sounding device for measuring ocean depth, aerial cameras for photographing coastline and glacier formations from above, and the botanical collecting equipment her good friend Alice Eastwood, a respected botanist at the California Academy of Sciences, had personally trained her to use. Let me explain what this scientific transformation actually looked like in practice, because I don't think she became a scientist quite captures the specific patient work involved. A typical day on one of these later expeditions might begin before dawn, with Boyd and her aerial photographer boarding a small seaplane launched from the Veslikari's deck, circling a glacier front for hours to capture the kind of systematic overhead documentation no ground survey could ever match, before returning to the ship so the botanist could go ashore with collecting equipment while daylight and weather allowed. Evenings were spent cataloging the day's specimens and photographs, comparing notes against whatever existing charts of the coastline the expedition carried, charts that were, more than once, simply proven wrong by what the day's survey work had actually found. Boyd's expedition systematically surveyed and photographed hundreds of miles of Greenland's northeast coastline, much of it barely charted before her arrival, correcting maps that were, by more than one account, simply wrong in significant ways, coastlines drawn from decades-old, secondhand observations that her own aerial photography could finally replace with something accurate. She collected hundreds of botanical specimens under Eastwood's guidance, several of which turned out to be new to Western science, carefully pressed and cataloged aboard a ship pitching through some of the roughest waters on the planet. Her 1937 and 1938 expeditions, working the Arctic Ocean northeast of Norway, used that echo-sounding equipment to help establish the existence of a previously unknown underwater mountain ridge running between Jan Mayen Island and Bear Island, a genuine contribution to the geological understanding of the sea floor in a region almost nobody had ever measured with any precision before. None of this field work was safe simply because it had shifted from hunting to science. Ships working this stretch of coastline still faced sudden storms, still risked being trapped by shifting pack ice with no guarantee of a clear passage back out before winter closed in. And Boyd's crews spent real time navigating exactly those hazards on every single expedition she led. In 1938, Boyd's ship reached a point on the northeast coast of Greenland, farther north than any vessel had previously managed to sail, the second highest latitude any ship had ever reached at that point in history. It's worth pausing on what that specific achievement actually required: navigating a ship through pack ice conditions that had turned back better funded, more heavily crewed expeditions before her, with the constant, unavoidable risk that a sudden shift in the ice could trap the vessel for the entire winter, stranding everyone aboard hundreds of miles from any possible rescue. For this achievement, the American Geographical Society awarded her its Cullum Geographical Medal, one of the most prestigious honors in the entire field, an award that had, up to that point, gone exclusively to men since its creation decades earlier. She was the first woman in the medal's history to receive it, in recognition of her survey work around the region's De Geer Glacier, Norwegian authorities went on to name a stretch of mountainous territory north of Scoresby Sound Louise Boyd Land, a permanent mark on the map of a country that, 12 years earlier, she'd only visited to shoot polar bears for sport. It remains there today, one of a small handful of places on Earth carrying the name of a woman who never once, in any of her published writing, described herself using the word explorer without some qualifying modesty attached to it. Now, I want to slow down here because I think this is the moment in Louise Boyd's story that deserves the most honest, unflinching look, and it's worth doing before we push into her final, highest stakes chapter. Because the version of Louise Boyd we've just described, rigorous, credentialed, celebrated by the most prestigious geographical institutions of her era, sits alongside a genuinely more complicated reality that biographers, Joanna Kafarowski included, have taken real care to document honestly. Louise Boyd was never a trained scientist in any formal sense. She had left school in her teens, had no university education, no academic credentials of any kind, and by her own crew members' accounts, faced real skepticism from at least some of the professional men she worked alongside, who doubted, at least initially, whether a wealthy amateur with no scientific background could meaningfully lead expeditions of this scope. What she had instead, and what made the entire arrangement work, was money. Enough personal wealth to charter the best available ships, hire genuinely credentialed scientists to do the specialized field work, purchase the most advanced available equipment, and fund the publication of beautifully produced scientific volumes through the American Geographical Society that put her own name, as expedition leader and photographer, on work substantially carried out by other people's specialized expertise. It's worth asking honestly what becoming a scientist actually meant for a woman in Louise Boyd's specific position. She never personally analyzed a rock sample or classified a plant species herself, work she consistently and openly credited to the trained specialists traveling with her. She organized, financed, photographed, and, crucially, provided the singular force of personal will that got ships, crews, and credentialed experts safely into some of the most remote coastline on Earth and back out again. That is a genuinely real and rare skill, but it is a different skill than the one the phrase leading scientist usually implies, and I think it's worth naming that gap honestly, rather than letting the Cullum Medal and the AGS partnership tell a cleaner story than the reality actually supports. I think there's a second related layer of complexity worth sitting with here too. Several of Boyd's contemporaries and later biographers describe her as intensely image conscious, someone who cared a great deal about how she was perceived, who insisted on maintaining full, elegant, formal dress, and hosting proper dinner service even aboard a cramped ship in the middle of the Greenland Sea, changing for dinner every single evening, regardless of how far from civilization the ship actually sat, and who could be demanding, controlling, and difficult for expedition members to work under. This wasn't simply eccentric personal style. It reads across multiple accounts as a carefully maintained performance, a woman acutely aware that the press and the public wanted a specific story from her. Wealthy socialite conquers the Arctic without sacrificing an ounce of her femininity, and who worked hard, consciously or not, to keep supplying exactly that image alongside the genuine scientific output. She insisted on being the sole photographer credited for expedition images even when other crew members had operated the camera at her direction, and she was known to be sharply protective of her own public narrative, quick to correct any account of her expeditions that gave too much credit to the scientists traveling under her employ rather than to her own leadership and vision. The 11 polar bears from 1926 and the Cullum Medal from 1938 aren't really two separate chapters of an evolving woman. They're two versions of the same underlying instinct, an acute, lifelong understanding of how to use spectacle, whether a hunting trophy or a scientific medal, to hold public attention and keep the money and the invitations flowing toward the next expedition. I don't think either of these observations should cancel out what Louise Boyd actually accomplished. The maps her expeditions produced were genuinely more accurate than what existed before her. The undersea ridge her equipment helped identify was genuinely there, whether or not she personally understood the geology behind it. But I think the honest version of the story sits somewhere between brilliant self-taught scientist and wealthy hobbyist who bought her way into the history books, and I don't think Louise Boyd herself would necessarily have objected to that framing. She never claimed to be a laboratory researcher. She claimed correctly to be someone with the money, the will, and the organizational talent to get real scientists to places real scientists otherwise couldn't afford to go, and then to make absolutely certain the world noticed she'd done it. I think it's worth asking, too, what alternative path was actually available to a woman with Louise Boyd's specific combination of interests and resources in the 1930s. No American university was training women for Arctic fieldwork leadership roles. No government agency was funding female expedition leaders on merit alone. The route she actually took, buy the ship, hire the experts, take the photographs, claim the credit, wasn't a shortcut around a fairer system that would have otherwise recognized her. It was, in a very real sense, the only door that existed for a woman in her position at all, and she walked through it about as capably as anyone in her circumstances plausibly could have. Chapter 4. The Mission. Her own crew didn't know about. By 1939, Louise Boyd had spent 13 years and a significant fraction of her personal fortune building a genuine reputation as the world's leading female authority on the coastline of East Greenland. Then the Second World War broke out in Europe, and everything about her work changed meaning overnight. Her 1937 and 1938 expeditions had produced something nobody, least of all Boyd herself, had originally intended: an extraordinarily detailed, extraordinarily current photographic and cartographic record of a stretch of Arctic coastline that was about to become strategically vital to a war she hadn't been thinking about at all when she gathered it. Greenland sat directly along the shortest air and sea routes between North America and Europe. Whoever controlled its coastline, its harbors, its weather stations, held a serious advantage in the war that was coming, and almost nobody outside Boyd's own small circle of collaborators actually possessed detailed, recent, systematically gathered knowledge of that specific coastline at all. In 1940, with her latest book of Greenland photographs ready for publication through the American Geographical Society, the United States government intervened directly. Officials asked her to delay publication entirely on the explicit grounds that the level of coastal detail in her photographs, information that had never before existed anywhere else in this kind of comprehensive form, could hand a real advantage to enemy forces if it fell into the wrong hands. Boyd didn't just agree to the delay. She went further, voluntarily sharing her complete, unpublished records directly with the United States government, years of painstaking, self-funded fieldwork handed over quietly, with no public credit, because the country that had never let her join its most exclusive scientific institutions was now asking for her help. The book itself would not see publication until 1948, nearly a decade after she had originally finished it, once the strategic sensitivity that had once surrounded it belonged entirely to history. In 1941, that quiet cooperation became something considerably more serious. The publicly announced reason for Louise Boyd's seventh and final Arctic expedition was straightforward and entirely plausible. At the request of the United States government's National Bureau of Standards, She would study how the Arctic's powerful magnetic fields interfered with long-distance radio communication, urgently useful research given how badly a coming war would depend on radio contact across the North Atlantic. That was true. It was also not the whole story. Boyd chartered and personally paid for a schooner called the FEM Morrissey, commanded by Captain Robert Bartlett, the same veteran ice captain who had once sailed with Robert Peary on his own polar expeditions decades earlier, a direct living link between Boyd's own career and the earlier generation of polar exploration she had grown up idolizing. She was appointed the Bureau's official consulting expert for a symbolic salary of $1 a year, the same nominal wage the government would later famously pay countless industrialists and experts who volunteered their skills for the coming war effort and set out along the west coast of Greenland and down through Baffin Island and Labrador. Her own crew was never told the real reason for the voyage. They understood themselves to be supporting a scientific study of radio interference, ordinary, if specialized, research work, unaware that the woman directing their course was quietly relaying strategic observations to officials who had no formal connection to the mission's publicly stated purpose at all. Reporters had covered the expedition's departure from Washington, D.C., with real fanfare and more than a few residents back home, watching newspaper coverage of an American socialite sailing north in the company of high-ranking military officers seemed to have wondered exactly what was actually going on, without ever getting a clear answer. Quietly, alongside the radio research, Boyd was working directly with the United States War Department and Coast Guard, helping identify potential sites for American military bases along a coastline she now knew more intimately than any other person alive, and supplying detailed charts that would prove essential once the United States formally entered the war later that same year. The woman who had once been dismissed as an unqualified socialite playing at exploration was now, quietly and without public acknowledgement, one of the most valuable sources of Arctic strategic intelligence available to the United States government, trusted with information her own hired crew wasn't cleared to know. I want to sit with the strangeness of this moment because I think it's genuinely one of the most remarkable turns in her entire life. 15 years earlier, Louise Boyd had been a wealthy tourist shooting polar bears for newspaper headlines. Now, in her early 50s, she was operating on what amounted to a covert intelligence assignment for a government about to enter the largest war in human history, using knowledge she had built entirely on her own initiative, funded entirely with her own money, at a time when nobody in any official capacity had asked her to acquire it in the first place. There is something almost unbearably fitting in the fact that the same government now quietly relying on her Arctic expertise had never, at any point in her career, offered to fund a single one of her expeditions in advance. She built the knowledge first, entirely on her own dime, and only afterward did it become valuable enough for any one official to want a share of it. The United States Department of the Army later presented her with a certificate of appreciation for work that, in the driest possible bureaucratic language, genuinely mattered to national security. You might think that a woman who had just quietly served her country's war effort, who had spent decades building an unmatched personal knowledge of some of the most strategically important coastline on Earth, would finally have earned a permanent secure place among the formal institutions of American exploration and geography. But no, the Explorers Club, the most prestigious organization of its kind in the United States, would not admit a single woman as a member, Louise Boyd included, for another 4 decades. It finally opened its doors to women in 1981, 9 years after Boyd had already died. Instead, her professional community had always been and would remain for the rest of her working life the Society of Women Geographers, an organization founded in 1925 by a small group of women explicitly because the men's clubs wouldn't have them, and whose ranks eventually included Amelia Earhart alongside Boyd herself. It's worth sitting with the specific unfairness of that timeline for a moment. A woman capable enough to be trusted with information her own hired ship's captain wasn't cleared to know, decorated by 2 foreign governments and awarded a certificate by her own country's army, was still, in the eyes of the organization that mattered most inside her own specific field, simply not eligible for membership on account of her sex. Even at the absolute peak of her documented, government-verified usefulness to her own country, the specific door that mattered most inside her own field simply never opened for her at all. Her wartime service marked the effective end of her active Arctic exploration career. She was in her mid-50s by the time the war ended, and the fortune that had financed 7 separate expeditions across nearly 2 decades had been substantially and permanently spent. It's worth pausing on the shape of that specific ending. There was no dramatic final failure, no accident, no single moment where the expedition simply stopped. The money that had made every previous chapter of her life possible had, quietly and gradually, run its course, spent on ships, scientists, cameras, and a war effort that would never publicly credit most of what she'd actually contributed to it. A woman who had spent 2 decades deciding, entirely on her own authority, exactly where in the world she would go next, found herself, for the first time since her parents' deaths a quarter-century earlier, without the resources to simply decide to go anywhere at all